Here are the 4 powerful tips to help you make the most of your knights. First things first, always centralize your knights. Knights are most effective when they are placed in the center of the board. When a knight is centralized, it allows him to reach a larger number of squares and exert more influence over the game. So always aim to develop your knights to the squares like c3, c6, f3 and f6. And that is why in the chess game you will most often see players developing their knights towards these squares. If a player develops its knights on the side of the board, then its power decreases because here on the side of the board it cannot control as many squares as it could have while being in the center of the board. So as you can see, this knight which has been centralized is able to control 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 squares, whereas this knight is able to control a total of only 4 squares. So its power has got reduced because it is developed on the side of the board. And as the popular chess saying goes, a knight on the rim is dim or a knight on a rim is grim, whichever version you might have heard. Let's move on to tip number 2. When you have knights with you, always look for fork opportunities. Knights are great pieces when it comes to forking opponent's pieces because of their unique L-shaped movement. So when you have knights in the game, always look for opportunities to simultaneously attack 2 or more enemy pieces. So for example, in this situation, it was black's turn and black makes the mistake of capturing this knight on f3, attacking the white's queen. So does white capture back this bishop? No, white here plays a very powerful move with his knight, and that is knight takes queen. Now if bishop takes white's queen, then the white knight can fork black's pieces by capturing on the c7 square. Knight takes c7 leads to a check as well as forks black's king and the rook. King moves to d7 and now the knight captures on the a8 rook. And now white has a winning advantage in the game because white is 3 points up in material. Let's look at one more example. Here it is black's turn in the game. And look how this black pawn is attacking this weak pawn over here, as well as the black's knight is placed at a very good square. So keeping these things in mind, black can play pawn takes pawn check. If the king takes the pawn, then knight e4 would force white's pieces, leading to an easy win in the game. Let's go back. If here in this situation, after pawn captures pawn check, if the white king doesn't take this pawn and instead moves on the f1 square, then black can now check the white king with his queen. So queen b4 check, white's king has no places to go. So now he is forced to capture this f2 pawn over here, and now this knight can again fork white's pieces, winning the game. Knight forks are particularly common in the opening stage of the game, with these 4 pawns being most vulnerable to knight's attack. If the knight is able to capture any one of these pawns, then he can fork the king and the rook, as you can see over here. And if the knight can capture one of these pawns, then it can fork the queen and the rook. So in the opening of the chess game, players need to be very conscious of protecting these 4 vulnerable points. So white needs to be conscious about these 2 points in his territory and black needs to be conscious about these 2 vulnerable points in his territory. A typical example that you might have come across a number of times in the openings is e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, eyeing this weak vulnerable pawn over here. And now if black is not conscious and plays a move like knight to f6, then white can immediately play knight g5, double attacking this weak pawn over here and threatening to fork black's pieces. So let's go back in the game. So whenever an opponent's knight come out in the game, you need to be somewhere conscious of the opponent's knight trying to drop in your territory and attacking your weak points. So if now this knight comes out, you have to stay conscious that this knight might drop either on this square or this square to attack this vulnerable point. In short, always watch out for the attacks on c2, c7, f7 and f2 points. Do like this video and subscribe to my channel if you are finding this information useful. And now let's move on to tip number 3. Always use your knights to set up smothered mate. So here in this situation, black can give a double check to white's king by playing knight to h3. So the white king is now being attacked by black's knight as well as black's queen. So the white player cannot capture this knight or this queen. So the king has to move. So king moves to h1, and because this knight is beautifully controlling this square, so now black can execute a forced checkmate by playing queen g1 check. White cannot capture with his king because the knight is protecting the queen, so he is forced to capture with his rook. And now because the king is trapped with his own pieces, black can deliver a smothered mate by playing knight to f2. Let's look at one more beautiful example. Here black's king is surrounded by his own pieces and doesn't have any space to move. So taking advantage of this situation, white can deliver a smothered mate with his knight by getting his knight to the d6 square. Notice the pawn cannot capture this knight because he is pinned by the white's queen to the king. And now comes the last and the most important tip, and that is always find outposts for your knight. Now you may be wondering, what is an outpost? Well, outpost is a square in the opponent's territory which cannot be controlled by any of the opponent's pawn. So for example, in this situation, if you look at the e5 square, this is a very good outpost for knight. And the reason why this is an outpost, because none of the black's pawns are able to control this e5 square, making it a very good outpost for knight, because when you put your knight on this e5 square, this knight cannot be kicked easily by the opponent, and he is sitting deep in the opponent's territory, controlling very key squares in the opponent's territory as well as protecting your key squares in your territory. Notice the opponent doesn't have any pawn which can kick this knight, neither he has a dark squared bishop which can attack this knight. So because of this, it's very hard for the opponent to get rid of this knight in his territory. If he really wants to get rid of this knight, he might have to sacrifice his rook for this knight. When knights find a good outpost in the opponent's territory, they become extremely dangerous, and they are often called the octopus knight because of their ability to control 8 squares like an octopus. So here in this example, though the material is equal, but white has a better advantage in the game because of white's nicely placed knight. Because black's bishop is not doing anything important. Even if he comes on this square, he is not attacking anything in the white's territory. But if you look at white's knight, it is controlling all the key squares in the queen side as well as the king side of the black's territory. Do join the channel's membership program if you want to learn chess at a deeper level. So you have to tell me, what is the best move for white in this situation? Let me know your answers in the comments box, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, keep learning, keep practicing.